The blood came without warning, it always did. A woman crouches at the edge of a river somewhere in what is now northern Spain, roughly 25,000 years ago. The water is cold enough to ache. She has been awake since before the light came up, and she is tired in the particular way that has no name in any language she speaks. A deep, low, pulling tired that starts in her hips and travels. Around her, the camp is stirring. Fires need feeding. Children need watching. The hunters left before dawn, and they won't return until the sky goes red. She has 4 or 5 days of this ahead of her. She knows it the way she knows weather and season and the smell of a predator. Not from anyone teaching her, but from her own body, repeated across years, reliable as the moon. There is no product for what she needs. No manufactured material, no infrastructure, no supply chain. There is only what the land provides and what her group has learned to do with it. She will handle it. Her mother handled it. Her grandmother's grandmother handled it. Going back past the point where we can trace any individual life, the women in every human population on Earth handled it, every single month, for their entire reproductive lives. And somehow, across hundreds of thousands of years, they did. Not barely. Not in a way that sidelined them or made them dependent or broke the rhythm of daily survival. They handled it while hunting, while migrating, while giving birth, while raising children, while building the social architecture that kept their groups alive. The question nobody thinks to ask, and the answer that changes how you see everything, is exactly how. If this is already landing, subscribe and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. The first wrong assumption is that menstruation was somehow rarer or less significant in prehistoric populations than it is today. The logic goes like this. Ancient women were pregnant more often, nursing longer, less well-nourished, and therefore had fewer periods overall. That part is actually true. A woman in a Paleolithic forager band probably menstruated far less frequently across her lifetime than a woman in the modern industrialized world. Later onset of puberty due to lower body fat thresholds, longer intervals of breastfeeding, which suppresses ovulation, and more frequent pregnancies likely meant she had somewhere between 50 and 150 lifetime menstrual cycles, compared to the 400 to 500 that are now considered typical. But fewer does not mean absent. And it absolutely does not mean unimportant. Even at the low end of that estimate, a woman in a mobile foraging group was managing her period for roughly 4 to 5 days at a time, multiple times a year, for the majority of her adult life. In conditions that were, depending on the season and the region, brutally cold, wet, and physically demanding. Without privacy as we understand it. Without any separation between her working life and her physical state. The more honest framing of the question is not, how rarely did this happen? It is, what did they actually use and how did they manage it within the structure of daily life? Researchers who study this intersection of paleoanthropology, ethnobotany, and the archaeology of female lives have assembled a fragmentary but increasingly detailed picture. It draws on 4 main sources: botanical evidence of plant materials with documented absorbent or astringent properties, comparative ethnography of forager and early agricultural populations observed in the 19th and 20th centuries, archaeological finds of fiber, hide, and organic material processing, and direct analysis of burial sites and bodily adornment that illuminate what ancient women understood about their own bodies. None of these sources is complete on its own. Organic material decays. Soft tissue leaves almost nothing in the archaeological record. But together, they point toward answers that are specific, practical, and in some cases, genuinely counterintuitive. Start with the most basic material question. What absorbed it? The short answer, supported by ethnographic records from forager and early agricultural populations on multiple continents, is almost everything that was soft, available, and could be held in place. Dried moss was almost certainly among the earliest solutions, and not by accident. Several moss species, particularly sphagnum moss, the same genus later used to dress battlefield wounds in World War I because of its remarkable absorption capacity and mild antimicrobial properties, can hold up to 20 times their own weight in liquid. That is not a coincidence or a curiosity. That is a material that performs, at a structural level, better than many early manufactured alternatives. Sphagnum was available across enormous swaths of the Northern Hemisphere. It was lightweight, easily gathered, and could be dried and stored. Indigenous populations in North America, Scandinavia, and Siberia used it for infant diapering and wound care well into documented history. Uses that tell us exactly what properties people recognized in it millennia before anyone wrote anything down. Softened animal hide was another solution documented across multiple cultures. Hide that had been worked to a fine, supple texture. The same hide-working process that produced clothing and shelter material could be cut into pads, folded, and secured. The securing method is the detail that tends to surprise people. A simple waist cord, often already worn as part of daily dress, with the pad folded or tied against it. Variations of this arrangement appear in ethnographic records from populations as geographically distant as sub-Saharan Africa and the Arctic. Plant fibers processed into crude felt or wadding also appear in the record. Cattail fluff, the soft, fibrous material packed inside the brown seed heads that grow in wetlands, is highly absorbent, available seasonally across temperate and boreal regions, and requires no processing beyond harvesting. The interior fibers of certain seed pods, dried grasses processed by hand into soft pads, and bark fibers that had been shredded and softened have all been documented as absorbent materials in ethnographic literature. What this material record tells us is something important. The solution was almost certainly not one thing. It varied by region, season, what was available, and what the specific group had learned and transmitted. There was no single universal answer because the world that produced these women was not uniform. A woman in coastal Atlantic Europe had access to different materials than a woman on the East African savanna. Both had solutions. If this video is giving you something to think about, subscribe and turn on notifications. It helps us keep making content like this. The second layer of the question, harder to answer and more contested among researchers, is how menstruation was integrated into the social and functional life of a forager group. The older popular picture was essentially one of seclusion and limitation, that menstruating women were removed from normal activity, either by cultural taboo or simple physical necessity, and that this represented a periodic deficit for their groups. That picture is almost certainly wrong on its practical dimensions, even if the cultural dimension was sometimes real. Here is the physical reality. Modern clinical research on menstrual symptoms in populations without processed food, artificial light cycles, and sedentary lifestyles tells a complicated story. Dysmenorrhea, the cramping and pain associated with menstruation, is genuinely common across populations, but its severity is influenced by prostaglandin levels, which are in turn affected by diet, physical activity, and body composition. Populations with high physical activity levels and diets high in omega-3 fatty acids, which describes most forager groups, tend to show lower severity of menstrual pain than sedentary populations on processed diets. This does not mean Paleolithic women felt nothing. It means the incapacitating version of menstrual pain that is common in modern populations may not have been the default experience. And forager groups cannot afford to lose a productive member for 4 days every cycle. The division of labor in mobile hunter-gatherer bands is well documented through both archaeology and ethnography. Women's gathering activity in most studied populations contributes between 50 and 80% of the group's total caloric intake. A system that regularly sidelined half the adult female population for days at a time would be a system under serious selective pressure to solve that problem, either behaviorally, through social arrangements that redistributed labor, or biologically, through the kind of lower pain response that higher physical fitness and better dietary fat ratios tend to produce. The answer was probably some version of both. Ethnographic records from forager populations studied in the 19th and 20th centuries show a range of social responses to menstruation, and they don't resolve into a single clean picture. Some groups practiced formal seclusion. Menstruating women withdrew to specific areas, were subject to dietary restrictions, or were excluded from certain activities like food preparation or hunting preparation. Others had no formal restrictions at all. What seems to vary most is not the physical management of the period itself, but the cultural meaning assigned to it, and that meaning, where it existed, was rarely purely negative. In a number of documented forager and early agricultural cultures, menstruation was understood as a marker of connection to cycles larger than any individual life. The 28-day lunar correspondence, not perfect and not universal, but close enough across populations to have been noticed, meant that menstruation was legible in a cosmological framework for people who read the natural world the way a modern person reads a screen. There is documented ethnographic evidence from indigenous populations in North America, Australia, and parts of Africa of menstrual blood being used in agricultural ritual, offered to the earth as part of planting ceremonies, or treated as a material with power rather than simply as a biological waste product. Whether any of this applies to Upper Paleolithic populations, the people painting the walls of Lascaux, the people burying their dead with ochre and ornament, we cannot say with certainty. The archaeological record of female-specific ritual is real but thin, and interpreting it requires care. What we can say is that the symbolic life of prehistoric humans was not simple, and that assuming menstruation was experienced purely as a burden to be hidden is an assumption that the evidence does not support. There is one specific piece of the archaeological record that the mainstream account tends to underweight, and it concerns ochre. Red ochre, iron oxide ground into powder or used as pigment, appears in the human archaeological record with extraordinary frequency and depth. It has been found at Middle Stone Age sites in Africa, dated to more than 160,000 years ago. It appears in burials, in cave art, on tools, and on the bodies of the dead. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, a site dated to roughly 100,000 years ago, archaeologists found ochre processing kits, abalone shells used as containers, with traces of a mixed ochre compound still inside, alongside the grindstones used to prepare it. The traditional interpretation of ochre is primarily symbolic and artistic. It was pigment for cave walls, for body decoration, possibly for hide preservation. All of those uses are real and documented. But some researchers, including those working at the intersection of behavioral archaeology and studies of female reproductive biology, have noted that ochre's documented antimicrobial properties, it inhibits the growth of certain bacteria, make it a plausible component in the hygienic management of menstruation. Not as a definitive claim, as a possibility that the evidence does not rule out and that the material properties of ochre make genuinely plausible. This is not fringe speculation. The connection between red pigment, female bodies, and reproductive cycles appears in the symbolic record of multiple ancient cultures across multiple continents. Whether ochre's earliest and most persistent presence in the human record is connected, in any practical way, to menstrual management remains unresolved. But the convergence of timing. Ochre appears consistently from the period when behavioral modernity is established in our species, and the material properties of the substance itself make it a question worth sitting with. Now for the piece that most accounts miss entirely: pain management. The assumption that prehistoric women had nothing for menstrual pain is incorrect, and the correction to it is specific. Ethnobotanical research, the study of how human populations have used plants medicinally across time, has identified a consistent pattern across cultures separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years. Plants containing compounds with analgesic, antispasmodic, or anti-inflammatory properties appear repeatedly in documented traditional medicine systems as treatments for menstrual pain, and in most cases, these are not plants that require sophisticated processing to release their active compounds. They can be chewed, brewed in water, or applied as a poultice. Willow bark contains salicin, the compound that would eventually be synthesized into aspirin. It grows across temperate regions of Europe, Asia, and North America. The pain-relieving properties of willow bark were documented in medical traditions from ancient Egypt, ancient China, and among indigenous populations of the Americas before any of these traditions were in contact with one another. That pattern of independent parallel discovery is not coincidence. It is the signature of a plant that actually works, found and used by people paying close attention to what the natural world offered. Yarrow, Achillea millefolium, appears in documented medical traditions on multiple continents as an antispasmodic used for menstrual cramping. It grows in disturbed soils across temperate regions and would have been available to forager populations across much of the northern hemisphere. Raspberry leaf, documented in herbal traditions from Europe to East Asia to indigenous North America as a uterine tonic, contains fragerin, a compound that has since been studied pharmacologically for its effect on uterine muscle tone. None of this means prehistoric women had an organized pharmacopoeia, or that knowledge was systematically recorded. What it means is that the knowledge almost certainly existed, transmitted orally across generations by the women who had tested it, the way all knowledge in oral cultures travels, through practice, repetition, and the testimony of people who had been helped by it. A forager group that had been in the same region for multiple generations would have accumulated an intimate knowledge of the local plant landscape, not abstractly. Specifically, this plant, for this problem, at this time of year, prepared in this way. That knowledge would have been held primarily by older women, the ones whose reproductive cycles had ended and who carried the accumulated pharmaceutical literacy of the group. Their role as knowledge holders was not incidental, it was structural. The transition from forager to farmer did not make menstruation easier to manage. In some specific ways, it made it harder. The first surprise is dietary. Forager diets, heavily weighted toward animal fat, wild plant diversity, and omega-3 rich foods from fish and game produced a hormonal environment associated with lower prostaglandin production, the compounds that drive menstrual cramping. The early agricultural diet narrowed that picture considerably. Grain-heavy, lower in fat diversity, subject to seasonal gaps and storage failures. Skeletal and paleopathological records from early farming settlements show that women's general health declined in the transition. Bone density decreased, signs of nutritional stress increased. The founding moment of civilization was, for many of the bodies living through it, a step down. What agriculture gave in return was stability of place. Mobile foragers had to carry everything. Every material solution, pads of hide or moss, medicinal plant stores, processing tools, had to be light enough to move with the group. A settled village could store more, prepare more, maintain a more consistent toolkit. The first evidence of woven plant fiber textiles appears in the early Neolithic, roughly 10,000 years ago in the Near East. Linen, produced from flax, was being processed in the Fertile Crescent by around 8000 BCE. Woven fabric is softer, more conforming, washable, reusable, a fundamentally better absorbent material than most of what came before it. The shift to settled life, for all its nutritional costs, almost certainly improved the material side of menstrual management. It also changed the social architecture around it. There is a specific archaeological signal from early agricultural societies that has been hiding in plain sight for decades. Across Neolithic Europe, the Near East, and parts of Asia, archaeologists have documented small ceramic vessels, often red-slipped, appearing consistently in female-associated contexts, that contain traces of tannins, alkaloids, and resins consistent with herbal medicine preparation. The tannin finding is worth pausing on. Tannin-rich plants, oak bark, pomegranate rind, astringent berries, have been used across documented medical traditions as treatments for heavy menstrual bleeding. Tannins cause blood vessels to constrict. This is not folk belief. It is a pharmacological mechanism independently documented in medical traditions from ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, and China. The Ebers Papyrus, an Egyptian medical text dated to roughly 1550 BCE, but codifying knowledge far older, contains specific formulations for managing menstrual irregularity and pain. Pomegranate, juniper, celery seed, wormwood, prepared with specific instructions. What the Neolithic ceramic evidence suggests is that this knowledge was not invented by literate scribes. It was already old when they wrote it down. The vessels are the material residue of a practice that preceded writing by thousands of years. Here is the reframe the evidence actually earns. We have been treating menstrual management as a problem women solved, a physical challenge requiring a practical solution. That framing is not wrong, but it is incomplete in a way that matters. In every forager and early agricultural society for which we have documented evidence, the people with the deepest knowledge of plant medicine were not the group's hunters. They were, consistently and across cultures, the older women, the ones past their reproductive years, the ones who had been accumulating and transmitting this knowledge since before memory. This is not a sentimental observation. It has a structural consequence. The oral pharmaceutical knowledge held by older women was survival knowledge. It managed pain that could otherwise limit productive activity. It treated hemorrhage that could otherwise be fatal. It helped regulate reproductive spacing. And in a mobile forager band, the spacing of births directly affected whether the group could move fast enough to survive. A woman who cannot nurse and carry a previous infant while heavily pregnant is a logistical problem for everyone. The plant-based knowledge that helped manage these realities was not peripheral to group survival. It was woven into it. Researchers studying forager social structure have noted that post-reproductive women in many documented populations hold status that is higher, not lower, than younger women. The Kungsan, the Hadza, the Agta. In these and other studied populations, older women are central to resource distribution, knowledge transmission, and decision-making. The grandmother hypothesis, developed by anthropologist Kristen Hawkes at the University of Utah, argues that the prolonged post-reproductive lifespan of human females was shaped by natural selection because grandmothers who stopped reproducing but continued foraging and transmitting knowledge improved grandchildren's survival enough to leave more copies of their genes. The menstrual pharmacology those women held was part of that knowledge base, part of a larger body of understanding about bodies, plants, pain, and reproduction that was the most sophisticated medicine those groups possessed. Look back now at the woman at the river in northern Spain. She is not managing a problem in isolation. She is not hiding something shameful. She is drawing on materials her group refined across generations, on knowledge transmitted by women now dead, who received it from women before them. An unbroken chain of practical intelligence stretching back past anything we can name. The older woman who sat with her when she first bled and showed her what to gather, what to prepare, what helped. That woman was the custodian of something her group could not function without. The specific plant on the north-facing slope, the time of year to harvest it, the way to prepare it so it worked. That knowledge did not survive in any form we can excavate. It lived in people. It moved through voices, through hands, through demonstration beside a fire. The stone tools and cave paintings and butchered bones that dominate the visible record cannot capture what was spoken and tasted and passed across generations in the dark. What we are beginning to reconstruct, through ethnobotany, paleoanthropology, and sharper attention to female-specific archaeology, is that prehistoric women's lives were not modern women's lives stripped of modern solutions. They were fully realized systems of knowledge and practice, refined across timescales that dwarf anything we think of as ancient, built around real problems with real answers that worked well enough to get you here. The moss was real. The willow bark was real. The woman who knew which plant to use and why was real. None of it was written down. All of it was remembered. When the first written medical texts appear, in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in the Indus Valley, they contain detailed, specific knowledge of female reproductive medicine that cannot have been invented by the scribes who recorded it. It is too precise, too pharmacologically accurate, too well adapted to the actual plants of those landscapes. It was already old. It had been old for a very long time. The women who handed that knowledge forward, generation by generation, across hundreds of thousands of years before anyone pressed it into clay or marked it onto papyrus, were not waiting for civilization to give them answers. They already had them. Thank you for watching. More videos are on your screen now, and if you haven't already, subscribe. We'll see you in the next one.